My name is Lynn and I'm studying to become a B.C.B.A. In today's video, we are going to cover Unit 4 of BEH 5043, which is Measurement and Design. And Unit 4 covers elements of visual analysis. So the first thing it starts off with is, what does visual analysis answer, right? So the two main questions that visual analysis looks at is, one, was there a meaningful change in behavior? And two, to what extent can the change be attributed to a specific environmental change, which would be your independent variable? And is there a functional relation, which tests rigor of the experimentation? It then moves on to types of displays within visual analysis. So we have data embedded in text. So it's like when they list off all the different results, right, in a results section within, say, an article. And then they also have data that's presented on a table. Once again, you'll probably find these in articles. And then they also have graphical display. For the sake of this particular unit, they really focus on graphical display, hence the visual analysis section. A graph is basically a data display providing visual representation of the relation between a series of measures and their relevant variables. Now, that's a lot of words basically to describe that. A graph takes all the raw data that you have and displays it graphically so that it makes sense. Otherwise, sometimes even with just a table, it's just a smattering of numbers and it's hard to make sense of whether or not there's been a change. So sometimes if you see rates of behavior go from like 50 to 45 to 80 to 35 to 22 to 45 to 100, it's hard to see that in a table, but when you see it graphically, it'll show you if there is any sort of trend to look for. So that's why a graph is so important within our field. That being said, it goes over the types of graphs that we use. The first and one of the older ones that we use is a cumulative record. The other one is a histogram, which is basically a bar graph with spaces in between the bars. The third one is a acceleration chart, which is kind of related to a cumulative record, but they'll go on into more detail within the unit itself, so I won't cover too much of the differences there. And then of course a basic line graph, so to speak, which can technically fall between acceleration chart or cumulative record depending on how you list it, but for the most part those are the four different types. The main one being the graph, the line graph that we use. So for parts of a graph, there's the horizontal x-axis, also known as the abscissa. There is the vertical y-axis, which is known as the ordinate. There are the axis labels, so you have to label, what is representing what. Usually the x-axis will represent time or sessions across time, and then y will describe basically the variable that you're measuring, right? The behavior that you're measuring. That's a general rule. There are some exceptions to it, but that's most of the time what you'll see. Then it goes on to phase and condition lines, which basically means, so like let's say you have a baseline, right, of something occurring. So you're just taking baseline data, you're just there and observing the behavior happening. You're not intervening or anything. And then you start intervention with a new condition or new phase. For the sake of this video and for what the unit covers, I'll be using the terms phase and condition interchangeably and synonymously. There is some discussion on whether or not they should be separate terms, but for this instance, I'll just be using them interchangeably. So starting intervention would be the next phase or condition, right? And then let's say you're doing a different design, you change back to baseline and then you go back into intervention. So you're basically showing that in this phase, there's no intervention, and then in this phase, there isn't an intervention. So that will separate the data because you never graph data between phases together. That's a very important thing. They really wanted to establish that. You never graph data in separate phases together. They are their own separate sets of data within the same graph. From there, they talk about the condition or phase labels, right? So they want to make sure that you can actually know what the phase is. If it's a baseline, write down baseline. If it's intervention 1 or intervention 2, write those respectively. And then it moves on to data points. So basically where you plot the data. So if it occurred 6 times, you're plotting it at the respective 6 across the ordinate and abscissa, right? The 7th piece they talk about is the data labels. So this or legend, I should say. So this basically is what is the whole graph showing. So generally you'll have kind of a subtitle, so to speak, or a label, and then you'll also have a legend, and you need both keys to identify what's happening within the graph. And then number 8 narrows down the figure legend. So if you have more than one condition that you're testing, or you're charting multiple pieces, if you're going to use like a dot versus a triangle versus a square versus an open circle. So you need that legend and figure legend to show people who read your graph easily, okay, this particular line follows when we used a car, this particular line's when we used a teddy bear. So we need to be able to discern between the lines. And this is a little bit more important than, say, color legends. They really want to point home that if you use a color legend on your graph, that's okay, but that's really hard to transfer, that's really hard to copy. Although in this digital age, it's a little easier. That doesn't remove the fact that if someone tried to just Xerox the item or copy it on a copying machine, that the colors won't come out, because a lot of the times they don't have color printing for that particular issue. That's why they really focus on, like, if you have different conditions that you're graphing, they really want you to specify with like an open circle, a closed circle, a triangle, a square as your data points to show those individual elements rather than coloring. Even though coloring is visually more appealing and visually easier to see, it's far easier to translate across multiple methodologies of showing if you use different shapes for your plot points. That being said, a vertical axis has a 2:3 ratio to the x-axis. So basically the height versus length. So you don't want a graph that's like ridiculously high on the y-axis and then like too short on the x-axis, right? Unless you have an outlying data point, in which case there's other ways to condense how that graph is supposed to look. Or you can put like a footnote of like there is an outlier data that's above what the y-axis is showing, and that will have a special break symbol for it. Basically, to have an even line graph, you're gonna have a 2:3 ratio of the x to y-axis. That being said, it moves on to discussing how data points don't always connect. So there are ignore days, there are change phase days. So once again, like I said, you would never connect data points between baseline and intervention conditions. You would keep those two sets separate. You wouldn't graph those two. Like I said, they do discuss how some people use the term phase and condition differently. So part of the world of ABA describes phase as a phase change from baseline to intervention, and condition as the condition was he was sick that week. So it kind of has a more overarching kind of confounding variable aspect to it, whereas others just used phase and condition interchangeably, so it's a little harder to determine. They will explain, though, within their methodology what they're referring to. So generally you shouldn't be too confused if you're reading an article and it has either a phase change or a condition change. From there, it moves on to descriptive statistics. So the mean, the median, and the mode, and what we do with all those. For the most part, they're all different types of averages, right? So mean is a calculated average. The median is the middle point when the data is lined up in ascending order. And then mode is the most frequent data point that occurs. So they're all different types of averages for the most part. And for the sake of our field, we generally use mean, but sometimes, very rarely, we'll use either median or mode, depending on what we are trying to measure. The 4 characteristics to observe would be level, trend, variability, and number of data points. So when they discuss like variables or characteristics to observe, that is why we're doing visual analysis. Why are we making this line graph? Well, we're looking for the trend, right? So we're looking for the direction of data, but we also need to find the level to compare it to, which is the mean average of your data points. And a level is always flat. A trend will either move into an increasing, decreasing, or no trend, or flat trend, zero trend. Technically, those are also used interchangeably, but in FIT, they do describe that a level or flat trend is when your data is kind of like going up and down between 2 points, right? And so that's a zero trend because it's not increasing nor decreasing. But then let's say you have a parabolic amount of data, right? Or a parabolic shape of data. That would be considered no trend, or that is in and of itself a cyclical trend. So they call that no trend because it's neither going up nor down. For that variability, it's basically measuring the bounce between the 2 data points, or all your data points really. So is your data really tight? Like does it stay within a range of 2 or 3 data points and constantly going between it? Or is it ranging from the entire x-axis, where some days you have like 1 instance and then the next day you'll have 50 and then the next day you'll have 3 and then the next day you have 80. Where's the variability coming from is really what they start looking into if you have high variability. High variability, depending once again on what you're measuring, can be pretty, like, it might be indicative of a separate issue occurring. So that's why it's important. If you have really tight variability where it's like all within a specific range and it stays around the level or the mean average of that data, that's more ideal, right? It's going to help you identify a trend easier, and not surprisingly, as it moves on, it talks about number of data points. You want to have at least 3 data points in order to measure your level, trend, and variability. That being said, they much prefer you to have as many data points as possible, right? And then you can average from there. But 3 is generally agreed to be the minimum. The last thing that Unit 4 covers is the split middle trend lines, which are approximate. So they have different ways that they can measure averages and how they measure trend lines, but they all pretty much result in the same thing. Basically, split middle trend lines is a method of determining mathematically what the trend is. So given your table of numbers, once you graph it, you can split the graph in half, and then you split those 2 halves again, and you find the level line of those 2 sections. So you take 2 halves and you split them again, you find the level line between them, and then you connect them diagonally depending on where they are. Or if there is no trend, then you would be connecting them flat, so it would be a no trend, so to speak. The best fit line is the trend line bisecting the data closest to equal amounts of data points above and below. So if you have 5 data points, the best fit line will hit across basically, presumably, that 3rd data point. So let's say it's an increasing trend, right? So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Your best fit line will bisect your data so that there's equal amounts of data points above and below it. So obviously if there's high variability, the best fit line is going to fit somewhere in the middle of that. It may not even fall directly on a data point, but usually it falls fairly close, ideally, right? High variability means it's harder to detect that. The last thing that they discuss within Unit 4 is to limit data paths to 3 or 4 per graph. So usually when we're tracking a single behavior, that's going to be 1 data path, right? So your data path is the lines that are connecting between your data points. From there, you can also track another behavior on the same graph. So then now you have 2. Well, they suggest going no more than 4, because after 4, it starts looking a little too crazy, right? Unless you're doing a multi-element design, which I've either touched base before already from last semester or will be touching base soon. Basically, even with a multi-element graph, you don't want to do more than 4, because otherwise it's just too many that are bisecting each other and it starts to look a little too crazy. Not to say you can't, you certainly can, but it does require a lot studying of your graph, and the whole point of visual analysis is to make it easier to read your data. So that's all the pieces of Unit 4. Hopefully it makes sense. I felt like it was a very easy unit because it just breaks down the mechanical parts of a graph. If you have any questions, leave them down below and I'll try to answer them as quickly as possible.